Okay, so you should all be seeing what I'm going to take you through is called the next wave, looking beyond COVID-19, and to a degree, it really answers Sir John's question from a broader perspective. And I'll just begin with a cartoon, which I think sort of covers the gist of what I'm going to be looking at, which is that we've focused in our discussion on COVID-19 and the potential for a bigger recession and stresses beyond that. But we need to be aware of a much, much bigger wave coming down the pike in the years and decades to come. And when I look at that, I see all these issues we're looking at around COVID-19 is more like as a dress rehearsal, which are exacerbating stresses in a lot of precariously poised, unbalanced systems, which will become stretched even to breaking point and maybe beyond breaking point in the years and decades to come. And the simple reason for that is to do primarily with climate breakdown. And the simple fact that right now we need to look at very, very drastic, deep structural immediate changes in our whole global economy just to reach that 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature rise and stay below that. And even aggressive measures right now would lead us to more like a 2-degree rise by the middle of the century. And right now our pledges and targets from Paris and current policies are moving towards what has been termed by global scientists catastrophic 3 to 5 degree rise. And we need to recognize that anything above 1.5 takes us to the zone of cascading, amplifying feedbacks, which leads our whole global system to a point of no return. And if we take the underlying reasons for that, you're probably familiar with this kind of graph that just looks from a big picture from the Second World War onwards. We're in this time of this great acceleration of usage of production, consumption, of energy usage, and it's continuing on this major rise up. And the result of that is even if we could somehow fix the climate problem with some sort of magic bullet, this great acceleration is causing vast ecological destruction across the board. We're looking at a 68% decline in animal populations worldwide since 1970. We've begun the 6th great extinction of species since life began on Earth, only this one is human-caused. We're looking at the annihilation of coral reefs worldwide by probably the middle of this century. And by around that same time, the UN estimates that 95% of Earth's land will be degraded. And here's the statistic that I find most unbelievable, hard to get your head around. But at current rates, by 2050, there will be more plastic by weight in the ocean than fish. Now, to try to understand this, where these stresses might lead, I'm going to introduce you very briefly to what's called the adaptive cycle model, which is a model designed by ecologists over a number of decades, a large number of ecologists, coming up with universally applicable sense of how change happens in living systems. And there are 4 phases to this kind of model. And it applies to all kinds of living systems like cells, evolution on Earth, or ecosystems, as well as to human systems like industries, markets, cultures, or civilizations. And I'll take you very briefly through each of these 4 phases to give you a sense of what this model, how this can help us think about things. Every system goes through a growth phase when innovative strategies exploit new opportunities, creativity and speed are rewarded. And then the system moves to oftentimes a much more long and stable conservation phase where rules, well-established connections become crucial. The future appears more predictable, but then over time the system becomes brittle, resistant to change, and less resilient until at a certain point it hits a release phase when a small disturbance can cause the entire system to collapse. And we're familiar with this in smaller cycles such as financial panic in markets or such like. And it's after that release phase, the system moves to what they call the renewal phase, when small chance events can drastically change the future in that next life cycle. It's as if the future is up for grabs. Now, many experts looking at our global system right now consider that this century we are in the process of undergoing probably one of the greatest transitions in human history, similar in scope to the one that went from hunter-gatherers to agriculture about 10,000 years ago, or the one that led to the modern age just a few hundred years ago. The question is, what will this release phase in our current modern age look like? Now, I've done some extensive research on that myself in researching for this book, The Patterning Instinct, A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning. And one big takeaway that came from that research is simply this, that culture shapes values, and those values shape history. And by the same token, our values will shape the future. So let's just take a moment to look at the underlying values of our mainstream culture of this growth-based global economy, which lead to this unsustainability. The undervalues are things like keep growing at all costs, maximize shareholder value, material consumption being seen as a proxy of welfare, and the sense of exploiting every available resource on the earth to achieve that growth. And as a result of that, if we look at global production today that's caused so much ecological devastation and climate disruption already, that's expected to triple by middle of this century, by about 2060. Now, a lot of people like to focus on this notion of green growth as this potential for, well, maybe if we can decouple GDP with raw material consumption, then we can keep growing without causing all these problems. But this basically has been debunked by the facts, which show that there is a very tight correlation between GDP and consumption that has not changed at all over decades. For this reason, we need to be aware that we are rapidly heading for a precipice. We've already passed 3 of the planetary boundaries that have been determined by Earth scientists as a safe operating space for humanity. 15,000 plus world scientists issued a warning to humanity recently saying soon it'll be too late to shift course away from our failing trajectory. At the Potsdam Institute, Professor Hans Schonhuber talks about a very big risk that we will end our civilization. And not too long ago, ex-UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon talked about this situation as being a global suicide pact. So just from this big picture, we need to recognize we have a choice as a global society ahead of us. We can maintain our underlying values, which will lead to this ecological overshoot and lead ultimately to an unmanaged release phase, which could well result in a civilizational collapse. Or we could actually change our underlying values as a society, leading to a more managed release phase, which would lead to a transformation of our economy and society and the potential for a more sustainable civilization ahead, which some people call an ecological civilization. So just very briefly, what is an ecological civilization? It would be a transformation of the basis of our global civilization from one that is wealth-based to one that is life-based. And it would be a global cultural and economic system that actually promotes sustainable flourishing for humans and Earth. And to get to that place would require a transformation in values in our mainstream way of thinking about things, an emphasis on the quality of life rather than material possessions, basing our political, social, and economic choices on a sense of our shared humanity and building civilization's future on the basis of symbiosis with the living Earth. And I'll just leave you a couple of thoughts and ideas of what that kind of shifting values might mean in practice for a corporation like Credit Suisse. Well, one is there's this opportunity to urgently divest from all fossil fuel financing, which is driving our head towards that precipice. So I know there's been some activity in minimizing or reducing coal investment, but extending that drastically to all fossil fuel financing. If we look beyond that to a larger scale, there's this potential for Credit Suisse and other large corporations to actually expand their scope of fiduciary duty in their corporate charters, so that they would be directed by their charters to optimize for multiple constituencies. So not just shareholders, but also employees, customers, suppliers, communities, and the environment. And from a larger societal perspective, a shift towards measuring success by well-being, not by GDP. And I know these are big issues and major disruptive ideas I'm putting out there. But one thing I'd want to leave you with is that these are necessary to avoid this path we're on. And if we do go in that path, maybe we can avoid this kind of scenario that I'll just finish my presentation with, to which I think is only possible if we actually make these changes now rather than wait until it's too late. So thank you for that, and I will now stop sharing the screen.